After the Taints left the Sol Sector, everyone tightened up their shock group as they prepared for the upcoming conflict that was now inevitable. At best estimates, the humans only had 7 months before the Pantheon showed up. 6 months and 3 days later, the sensor probes picked up something. Several somethings, in fact. After careful examination, there were 4 confirmed battle groups, being led by something very large, seemingly a very large ship. From the design, they were clearly Pantheon ships, at least most of them. One of the groups had a different silhouette, but was still identifiable. One of the groups, the largest one in fact, was from an arachnid species known as the floppy. Though their name incites laughter, there's nothing funny about these creatures. A strange amalgamation of scorpion with more spider-like legs than anything else. The dual tails each had a venomous stinger the size of a trailer hitch. The venom that came out of the tip of the tails was usually enough to paralyze or kill any other species, yet to humans, it was essentially cocaine, which is one of the reasons why they had so much of an issue when it came to their survey of the planet for colonization. The planet Earth, that is. Their 6 small shuttles landed in an active war zone, and due to their appearance, they were immediately engaged as everyone freaked out. Their carapace is strong enough to stop a AK-47 bullet, the standard 7.62 by 39, until you get to point-blank range. This allowed the floppies to get close and stab the humans with their stingers. Sticking several in a matter of seconds made them think that they had won the fight, pure and simple. Just as they believed that they had taken down so many humans that they could take for some sort of experimentation, testing, or whatever they were going to do, suddenly the humans all jumped to their feet, and they seemed to be so virile and so alert and so vicious that they were an amalgamation of Deadpool and Imo Kavonen. Then they attacked the aliens with so much fury that many of the floppies were left hanging limp and very dead within just a few minutes. Those that had escaped the fury of humans that were high on their own venom must have got away and told their friends, and maybe they got a bug up their butt about it, but it seems as though they had come back to party. This is no problem for humanity, as they had spent more than a decade preparing their own party favors. As the battle groups come out of FTL, they begin to scan the area. As told before, all they could find on their sensors were stations and drones. The groups advanced on all sides, complaining that they had came for a battle, and now they're going to be left facing a simple planetary invasion? Seriously, that's it? The floppy themselves wanted some payback. They wanted Earth, but they had to bargain enough just to get Mars to have for themselves. Given the amount of forces that were brought, this seems generous, especially since the Pantheon ships tend to be a little meaner. As they approached Mars, the floppy could see the drones still performing their tasks, the stations receiving materials and seemingly processing through sheer automation. Below is a colony world with barely anything on the surface. A few scattered domes that seem to be primarily set up for agriculture and air production. Yet, not much else. Many of the floppies looked at each other and swayed back and forth, which was their version of, "Is that it?" This would not be a battle they wanted, but instead a simple recovery mission. They just had to get through the surprising amount of debris in the system that seemed to be banging off the hulls of their ship constantly. The Pantheon fleet, being led by their invasion carrier, pushed through the debris field as well, yet they themselves headed towards Earth. They could see stations around Earth and its moon. As they got closer, they scanned the planet, and the scans also indicated that the thriving civilization on the surface, to their absolute astonishment, they could see that the pollution levels had decreased a lot, despite the population not actually changing much from what they could see. They saw this and continued forward, confused how an upstart species could have possibly gotten so far in such a short time. As they continue their advance, they think about how most species must reach a certain level before they can turn away from poisoning their own planet. Normally, there are at least two purges of the so-called families or clans that they try and control the population. The first purge only removes the heads, as in the adults of said families that control everything. Yet the lesson is not learned, and a few generations later, the entire bloodlines are hunted down and severed. This will always lead to a time of desperation for the species, as logistics are not exactly moving all so well, yet they almost always overcome it. Once the lesson is learned, the species is elevated to heights beyond their own reasoning. Yet there is no possible way humans could have gone through all these changes in just over one human decade. Getting close to Earth, the Pantheon continued to scan for anything they may find. All they can find were the stations and the abundance of life on Earth. Getting even closer, they began to scan the moon. It was easy to see that the moon had been colonized as well, though sparsely populated. Taking this objective would assure space superiority. Breaking off another full battle group to take on the moon, the main Pantheon fleet continued its path straight towards Earth. At approximately 3 times lunar orbit, a message was sent to all ships on every single wavelength. The message was clear to all who read it. You are trespassing. Leave this sector and never return. Stay and prepare to be annihilated. The entire Pantheon fleet read this and then laughed at the threat to the point of broadcasting their own laughter. To human ears, it sounded like somebody trying to puke while releasing wet farts. The Pantheon fleet just continued and had just about reached lunar orbit when another message came through. 3 words. We warned you. Within a few moments of that message, the Pantheon fleet attacking Earth and Luna, along with the Floppies attacking Mars, would no longer be laughing. Explosions sent hundreds of molten metal shards through their ships, so many, so fast that the crews had no idea what was happening or where in the hell it was coming from. The explosions penetrated so many compartments that trying to seal off the holes was just about impossible, especially with smaller ships. Many of the safety systems kicked in, sealing the occupants in a room venting atmosphere. They would die slow and painful if they were unable to find suits. In this case, those that were killed from the initial strike seemed to be the lucky ones. Those that could get into suits, or were fortunate enough to be in a non-venting atmosphere area, tried desperately to keep the ships running. After the first strike, nearly 80% of the Pantheon ships had been made inoperable completely. The rest showed their condition as they began to maneuver around the hulks of the ships that had been sent adrift. As the still functioning ships began to maneuver, projectiles with almost no thermal signature began flying at them from multiple directions. Any ship close enough to the station was torn apart by the rotary Vulcan Gauss cannons at over 6,000 rounds a minute. Many of the ships, especially those of the Floppy, were cut in half. Others were so covered in shots you would think that the gunner was trying to sign his name across the side. A few ships tried to make a break for it and found themselves being chased by guided munitions that seemed extremely difficult to shoot down with their defensive guns. It doesn't help that the current defensive guns of the Pantheon are only 60 shot a minute energy weapons. As the last of the fleeing ship has the last of their aft sections blown completely off, the invasion actually began. The difference being is that only a few were dropships heading towards the surface. Most were actually life pods, very few actual drop pods, heading to the closest planetary body. To the Pantheon's surprise, not a single pod was fired upon. On Mars, the floppy pods traveled faster due to the lack of atmosphere. This meant that their survival of landing dropped significantly. Floppy drop pods use drag fins to slow their descent and an inflatable cushion that, well, goes around the outside to lighten the impact. With little resistance, the impact was more than the floppy cushions could handle. Those fortunate enough to hit the surface at odd angles caused them to roll, meaning they didn't go completely splat. Though very far from a pleasant experience, they were at least still alive. The Pantheon pods used a combination of retro boosters, cushions, and parachutes to allow for a safe landing. The parachutes would deploy, but they were more than useless heading towards the lunar surface. Yet the lighter gravity of the moon allowed all of them to land safely. This was true on Earth as well, as the parachutes, though a bit small for the size of the pods, allowed them to make planetfall, though the high gravity of Earth made the landing a bit abrupt. Those that headed to the planets in shuttles or corvettes or what have you were able to head to the surface and land without an issue. It is thought of at this point that humans just had sheer luck on their side, as the fleet was adrift full of holes. The shuttles and corvettes would land close to the pods as they tried to make contact with the surviving forces, but the comms just didn't seem to work at all. Without comms, those on the surface of the moon and Mars just had to simply wait for some sort of communication and/or retrieval. They were shocked as they could feel the pods being struck by something, seemingly lifted and then transported somewhere. Scanning the area, it was clear that some sort of vehicle had picked them up. Checking the data, they could tell that there were the drones that had come and picked them up just as before. The pods of other floppy could be seen through the scanners on Mars, but it was clear that there were very few survivors, as most of the pods were almost unrecognizable. On Luna, the same dance occurred as the surviving shuttles tried to follow. For both, the pods were gently placed inside the hulks of one of the space stations. As the shuttles and corvettes watched the last of the pods loaded into the stations, they each were given a message. Join your brethren and power off all systems. Do so, and you will not be harmed. Attempt to fight or escape, and none of you will survive. With this, docking coordinates were also given. After only a short period of time, the enemy forces around Luna and Mars obeyed the instructions, though hesitantly. Upon landing, they were given instructions to vacate the ships and the pods. The bay had already been pressurized and filled with the appropriate gases along with the appropriate gravities. On both stations, both groups exited slowly as they didn't want to seem hostile. Exiting their vessels, they saw nothing. Nothing but the industrial chic of the inside of an empty cargo bay. Many ran into the appendages of those they knew personally, grateful that they knew somebody was still alive. Seeing this, many of the others broke mentally as they realized the massive losses of life in their forces they had just suffered. Above Mars, a few humans in bulky exosuits entered the bay. They informed the floppies that this was what remains of their forces. Seriously depressed, the floppy hung their tails limp, realizing the situation was beyond grim for them. A few thought for a moment of using their massive tails against their captors, but others stopped them, realizing the only thing stopping their captors from opening up the bay doors and spacing them all was the humans' good graces. As one of the warriors seemed to fight against his own people, restraining him, keeping him from trying to attack the humans, one of the elders calmed him down by saying, "Relax. I'd rather not piss these things off. On the station above Luna, things took a different turn. Since these prisoners were all Pantheon, a few tieflings were brought to let them clearly understand the circumstance they're in. This time, as the doors opened, two tieflings flanked by four humans in heavy power armor walked in wearing human clothes. The group of prisoners were more than surprised at these two tieflings, as they were both considered lost during the hunt. Speaking in the Pantheon language, the tieflings informed the prisoners that they had lost and were going to be held by the humans for the foreseeable future. A few command staff, to include three captains, began to demand their release, along with safe passage back to Pantheon space. When they were refused, the captains started calling the tieflings traitors. The tieflings began to get irate with the captains, screaming how they were left on hunting grounds to die because you never came for us. And, of course, the humans offered us sanctuary, food, medical care, and have even taken great care to make sure we are not abused. The outburst from one so young surprised the commanders, but also infuriated them, as the young speaking against their elder was completely unheard of in their society. The highest ranking Pantheon began to get very close to the tieflings as he continued to rant about dignity and respect. The more he spoke, the more enraged the tieflings got. Eventually, the captain screamed about how the tieflings should bow and beg to them. When the tieflings outright refused, the captain grabbed the female tiefling and tried to force her to the deck. The moment the captain reached out to grab her, a large metal hand grabbed his arm by the shoulder and lifted the captain several feet off the deck. The female tiefling was shaking as the male tiefling next to her asked if she was all right. The male tiefling looked over at the captain and said, "You really shouldn't do anything like that." The captain was still thrashing around and striking at the metal monster holding him, and then said, "What is this thing doing?" The female tiefling responded, "I should have warned you. My husband is the jealous type." The captain almost froze in confusion as he looked as the visor of the armor flipped open quickly, revealing a very human face with piercing green eyes that seemed to carve into the Pantheon's very soul. The expression on the human's face is one of sheer hate. This look put more fear into the captain than the thought of the metal hand just a few millimeters from breaking the captain's arm off. The female tiefling then went over to the human and asked him to put the captain down, saying, "Hamish, it's all right. Please don't kill him." Without a second thought, Hamish just dropped the captain. When his body hit the deck plating, others ran over to aid the captain. He shook them off and stood up, claiming he was fine, even as the dark outline of a hand was now visible on his upper arm. The male tiefling spoke, "It appears that we will have to show you the current situation. Even though you believe that winning against your fleet was just a fluke. Making you believe you have any authority here, we need to show you something." What happened next was duplicated on the station on Mars. The prisoners' attention was directed towards the cargo bay doors. A few thought they would be spaced until a strange green light turned on. Within just a moment, a nearly transparent pastel green energy shield stood between the cargo bay doors and the interior of the bay. This was impressive technology for an upstart species, but nothing to write home about, they thought. Then the cargo bay doors began to open. Many instinctively reached for something to keep them inside the bay, yet nothing moved. The energy shield is actually strong enough to hold the atmosphere inside, yet to do this, a system has to use so much energy and put so many electrons and everything else that it can actually be seen with the naked eyes. On both stations, they looked out and saw another metal wall. Confused, they believed that they had been taken further inside the facility without them knowing. Then they realized something. That wall is moving. It only took a few seconds to realize that what they saw was actually a massive ship nearly the size of the station they were on moving past them. Many got closer to the energy shield as the ship passed by to see the system full of activity. Large warbirds seemed to be scattered all around as shuttles moved back and forth from the stations to the surface. Drones were everywhere as they seemed to be in a hurry to dismantle the Pantheon and the floppy ships. The realization that Earth and humanity could have actually won in a slug match with the majority of the attacking forces made most of them just stand there in shock and couldn't speak, didn't even blink. Others, on this realization, simply fainted, while a few unfortunates lost control of their bodily functions. Each of the human warships was clean and covered with hatches and doors that seemed to be too small for humans, but why so many of them, they thought to themselves. Each warship seemed to be covered in layers upon layers of armor, yet it's just hard to tell at this distance, although it doesn't help that each one seems to have some sort of odd covering. Those in the depths of space seem to disappear as the almost black hull of the ship has almost no contrast with the backing of the void. Even without the ships, thousands upon thousands of satellites are around the planets and their moons that are clearly not just there for communication. As they tried to get a better look, the prisoners are warned not to touch the energy shield. When they ask why, the humans don't answer and simply throw a white sphere at the shield. As the cue ball itself hits the shield, the mass equalizes and cuts the ball in two. On closer inspection, the prisoners realize that it's not a clean cut, but instead, both halves seem to have ripped themselves apart down the center. It is enough to keep the prisoners away, of course. When they asked why air molecules are not broken in half, it is explained that there needs to be enough mass that actually pushes something through the shield itself. Gases are just far too thin. Yet if somebody tried to go through the shield, as soon as they got approximately 50% of their body through, everything would equalize on both sides, and it would quite literally rip them straight down the center. This got the attention of the prisoners enough that they would listen to the next announcement with great interest. They were told that their former ships would be searched before they were scrapped. Many of the captains were not happy with the idea of their ships being torn apart, but there wasn't anything they could say about it at the moment. If any survivors were found, they would be brought to the stations. This relieved the prisoners enough and calmed them down enough so that crews could be brought into the bays to start decommissioning the pods in the ship. It was nothing too serious, of course, as the humans simply stripped the weapons and engines. Everything else would remain to help them, sustain the prisoners, as these were obviously going to be mobile housing units. Inside the destroyed ships, groups worked quickly to save the few remaining personnel inside. The most common tactic used is to move to a sealed section with a multi-person survival pod, holding the pod open near the door and/or hatch, then cracking open the hatch. With precious little time at that point, at most a couple of minutes, they would rush to the survivors and get them into the pod as fast as possible and seal it. It only took a few seconds after that to pressurize once it was sealed, but the pods, they don't actually have a lot of amenities, as it's just basically a strange box. A few of the prisoners tried to fight, but being unable to breathe kind of puts a stop on that pretty fast. The retrieval teams actually got so good at their job that they made a game of throwing the survivors down the corridor like a baseball, right into the survival pod. and listening to the comms, you would think they were actually playing a game. Upon throwing the prisoner down the corridor towards the pod, if they got the prisoner in without hitting anything else, it was a strike. If they hit the side of the pod, well, that was a ball. If they hit the bulkhead on the way towards the pod, well, there's a foul. This made the teams work even faster and actually raised morale a whole lot. Though no one's morale was any higher at that moment than those that were actually inside the survival pods, realizing that they might be prisoners, but they're not going to slowly suffocate inside their own ships. Down on Earth, there was no morale for the Pantheons. Those in pods landed just fine, but they were almost all isolated on a death world. Communications were jammed entirely, so the only intelligence they could get is what they could see, and what they could see horrified them. The shuttles and corvettes that didn't immediately head to the surface found themselves under sustained attack by salvos of missiles. Even if they were able to fight off the missiles, human air superiority fighters arrived. These fixed-wing aircraft moved with speed and grace that simply boggled the mind. It isn't long before every Pantheon ship is forced to the surface whether they wanted to or not. Many crashing into the ground while still on fire. Across two hemispheres, the Pantheon are scattered and afraid. Afraid as their entire fleet has been essentially wiped out. Afraid as they can see large ships in the upper atmosphere that they did not even get close to hitting. Afraid that their own ships came crashing to the surface. Afraid as humans' air superiority fighters streaked across the skies, seemingly untouchable. Afraid because they're on a death world. Afraid because the humans will be coming. Some of the Pantheons are able to land with their gear. Several run to the closest large ship as they understand there is still strength in numbers. Most of the Pantheons that made it to the surface are Navy personnel. Except for their rite of passage, they have not lifted weapons in decades, if not centuries. As some of the Pantheon are able to get into larger group, others are ambushed and overwhelmed by humans, if they're lucky. Those that landed in the oceans, though, simply had to wait for extraction. Those that are picked up by human sea vessels do not fight at all, either due to desperation or due to dehydration. But if you're in the South Pacific, that sun will not take long to take the fight right out of you. Those on land are scattered all the way from Australia into South America. The amount of things that can bite, stick, poison, rip, tear, or just outright attack with no rhyme or reason is horrifying to the Pantheons. When human retrieval teams did get some, they were actually astounded how many auto-injectors full of atropine and also EpiPens they used. It was staggering even to humans. This made many of the Pantheons simply hide in their pods if they have nothing to rally to, and surrender to the first species that actually wore clothing. The true saving grace for the survivors that crashed on the planet was the fact that Pantheons are worth more a hell of a lot alive than dead, meaning that some of the more nefarious groups would still capture the Pantheons in one piece. The Pantheons that grouped up would try and hold together as they could see humans deploy, well, at least deploy way off in the distance. Their pride, arrogance, and stupidity made them ready to fight anything that might come their way. They expected the humans to fly in and bomb the shuttles, still not destroyed, but nope. As the Pantheons waited for the attack, the sun simply passed down below the horizon, bathing the area in darkness so complete as the canopy of the jungle stopped the light, especially in South America. The humans over there seemed to arrive. Like ghosts in the darkness, the soldiers would show up and capture one or two at a time and then fade away like a fart in the wind. By sunrise, The remainder were already freaking out and broadcasting their surrender as they did not know what to expect from the humans. As horrifying as that was, those pantheons that landed in Australia believed that they had actually landed on a hell world, as many of their numbers succumbed to the elements and the fauna that seemed to poison everything. Some pantheons thought of hunting for food, but it didn't matter if they had multiple legs or no legs at all. Everything would seemingly poison them. It got so bad so fast for the pantheons that the call to arms they had been broadcasting changed to a call for assistance. Any assistance they could get, they would out and out surrender. Only a few days after the failed invasion, a recording came to light from one of the Pantheon pods that showed its occupants near death from the heat of the Australian outback. As a few humans walked up wearing short sleeves and shorter pants, their pace showed that these humans were absolutely in no rush to be anywhere, but had a bit of concern in their eyes. After looking at the Pantheons and wishing them a good day, they offered water. The Pantheons were surprised with the cordial attitude of the humans, and even more surprised to find out that the water they were carrying was cold. The two men led the Pantheons back to civilization, where they would be taken to shuttles so that they could be taken to the station. The whole time, the Pantheons thinking, what the hell did we pick a fight with? In the aftermath of the battle, many humans were angry. Angry they didn't get a chance to fight. Angry that the survivors just surrendered. Angry that one of the human traps worked so damn well. It is so effective that the human fleet didn't even get a chance to fire a single shot per ship. Only about 5% of them actually fired anything. The human trap that caught the Pantheon and the floppy was thousands upon thousands of small devices that, on the outside, looked like little pyramids, 40 centimeters square at the base and then coming up to a tip. These are actually magnetic mines that would attach to the hull of the enemy ship as they drifted by, and then they would wait. They wouldn't just explode. As they landed on the ship, just in case they did not attach as the bottom of the pyramid against the hull, all sides of the pyramid would extend down, flipping it and forcing the base of the pyramid to face the hull. If one was looking at it, they would then be able to see the internal components. If you could see it up close, you could see that each of these mines had 5 pounds of syntax explosive inside of it. Also, the way it was set up, it was to be an explosively formed penetrator. When they attach to the hull, it just sounds like space debris bouncing off of the hull, so no one would even pay attention to it. When ready, all the mines would detonate, penetrating through the toughest armor the enemy has to offer and then some. And once through the hull, the EFP punches through compartment after compartment, causing massive depressurization, panic, and damage. Any sane captain would abandon the ship to save its crew at that moment. Those arrogant or crazy enough to stay would find themselves either stranded in one of the few pressurized components or suffocate as the atmosphere runs out because you can't plug that many holes. Now, as all the Floppy and Pantheon have been collected from their ships are being torn apart by drones. While they do so from the outside, inside, the tech crews are stealing all their version of hard drives to find out what the Pantheon and the Floppy had planned next. Seeing the battle won, the human navy continued its plans to aid humanity in expanding its territory to the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and, of course, the complete terraforming of Venus. With the battle won, humanity now has some peace, at least for a while. You see, humanity can stay hidden until it reaches a certain size. As they expand, they will reach a point where it's impossible to hide from other species. With this peace, though, they have more time to prepare, and they must prepare well, as in the future, there may be only war.